Okay, it is live.
Great. Well, good afternoon and welcome to this World Affairs Council of Orange County event today with Professor Michael Beckley. It's on the future of the United States of America as a future rogue superpower. Very intriguing title, which for me, I'm really looking forward to this presentation, as I'm sure you are. I'm Richard Downey, the chair of the Programs Committee at the World Affairs Council of Orange County, and it is a pleasure to have all of you here with us today. We would like to make sure that you are a participant as well as just listening in on this event with Professor Beckley. And you can do that by going down at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a Q&A button down there. If you'll just go onto that, click onto that, you can write a question at any time throughout the presentation. And at the end of after Professor Beckley's remarks, we'll start a Q&A session where your questions can be answered. So please feel free anytime that you have a question, just go ahead and put your Q&A down there on that, press that button. But we look forward to that kind of discussion. So we want you as an integrated part of this event. Today, our moderator will be Rick Putnam, who is our vice chair of the Programs Committee of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. It's a pleasure to have him with us as moderator, and he'll be introducing Professor Beckley. So let me hand it over to Rick right now. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Richard. Pleased to be with you all today. Michael Beckley is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and a Jeane Kirkpatrick Visiting Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Previously, Michael worked for Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, the U.S. Department of Defense, the RAND Corporation, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He continues to advise both the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. Department of Defense. He holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. His research on great power competition has received numerous awards and has been featured by numerous media, including the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, NPR, the Washington Post, to name a few. His first book, Unrivaled, Why America Will Remain the World's Sole Superpower, was published in 2018. Today, we're fortunate to have him review his recent foreign affairs paper titled Rogue Superpower and Why This Could Be an Illiberal American Century. With that, please welcome virtually Professor Michael Beckley.
Thanks very much, Rick, for the introduction, and Richard for having me out here. It's good to be talking to a California group. I'm actually a native son of California from the Bay Area, and I have a lot of family in Los Angeles. I wish I were with you all in person rather than stuck here in a snowstorm on the East Coast, but I'll make do as best I can. As the title of the article that Rick mentioned implies, a lot of people think that the United States is sort of in decline, it's becoming less powerful, and they also think the United States may become more multilateral, especially now that the Biden administration is in power. I actually think if we look a decade or two beyond that, I see a world where the United States actually could become more powerful relative to other countries, but also more unilateralist over the next few decades. And that's because I think, the world is about to get hit with two major trends that I think often go underestimated in the kind of geopolitical ramifications they're going to have. So the two trends are the rapid population aging that's going to occur over the next few decades. And then the second is the spread of smart machines that are going to make it a lot easier to automate a whole range of tasks, both economic, jobs, as well as military applications. And I think both of these trends are going to simultaneously reduce the United States' dependence on other countries, both economically and strategically, but they also may fuel nationalism, both within the United States and around the world. And so nothing is guaranteed, but you could have a situation where the United States actually remains quite dominant, but is less willing and able to sustain all of the Cold War era alliances and all the international institutions and the norms that it helped lead and build up after World War II. And instead, both the United States and the rest of the world could basically shift back to a much more traditional pattern that prevailed for centuries before the Second World War, where it was essentially every nation for itself. So to sketch this out, I'll basically just make 3 points over the course of this talk. One is I'll talk a little bit about US history and why I think what we've gotten so used to in terms of American grand strategy, this sort of liberal internationalist grand strategy where the United States supports all these different institutions and alliances, is actually really the exception in American history, that for most of America's history, it was much more unilateralist in its foreign policy. So the United States, in other words, has always had kind of commitment issues when it comes to providing global order. The second point I'll talk about is just the effect of aging and automation and how that's likely to affect both American power as well as US foreign policy. And then the third thing I'll talk about is how those two trends will affect other countries and their own reactions. So first, on just a little detour into US history. A lot of pundits, when the Trump administration was in office, routinely portrayed his foreign policy as this sharp break from anything we'd actually seen in the past. But I actually think the Trump doctrine has very deep roots in US history. Really, for the first, say 165 years of its existence, the United States defined its interests pretty narrowly, mostly in terms of money and physical security. And it pursued those interests very aggressively, with relatively little regard for the effects on the rest of the world. Yes, the United States espoused various Enlightenment ideals of freedom, liberty, but we have to be honest, it applied those values selectively, both at home as well as abroad. It didn't form any alliances besides the one that it signed with France during the Revolutionary War. American tariffs on foreign goods routinely ranked among the highest in the world. The United States shunned various international institutions. Really, the only ones it signed on to prior to the Second World War were things like the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war. And the whole reason the United States signed on to those was to basically avoid responsibility for what was going on in Eurasia. The United States was never isolationist. If you were one of the European powers and you had a colony here in the Western Hemisphere, you definitely knew the United States was not isolationist. If you were Native American, you definitely knew the United States was not isolationist because it had this rampant territorial expansion. But the United States was often, I would say, aloof, and was mostly out for itself. It wasn't the same kind of foreign policy that we've gotten used to today. And the reason the United States could pursue such a unilateralist policy was because it was uniquely self-sufficient and secure. By the early 19th century, the United States already had the world's largest piece of farmland. It had vast stocks of natural resources and raw materials. It had more internal waterways, the rivers and natural ports all stitching together a big national market, more of those than the rest of the world combined. And when you get to the end of the 19th century, the United States, by the 1880s, is already the world's richest country, the largest consumer market, the leading manufacturer and energy producer. So basically, with so much going for it at home, the United States didn't have a whole lot of interest in providing order around the world. That doesn't really change until the world wars and really during the Cold War, where suddenly the Soviet military is looming over a totally shattered Eurasia, and communism is gaining hundreds of millions of followers worldwide. And so it was at that point that American policymakers said, hold on, we actually need strong, prosperous partners to contain these threats, which are not only a security threat, but actually threaten the American way of life. And so the United States, of course, then bankrolls basically a giant alliance system, providing dozens of countries with security guarantees, easy access to American money and markets. But I would point out, even during the Cold War, at kind of the height of US liberal internationalism, America's unilateralist impulses never disappeared entirely. So I've done a bunch of research on US alliances and security commitments. And if you get into the diplomatic record, you see that American policymakers actually structure those alliances to prevent allies from dragging the United States into wars, which South Korea tried to do multiple times, Taiwan tried to do, and American policymakers had all these loopholes inserted that basically allowed them to say, look, we're not going to necessarily write you a blank check. The United States also did things like ditch the gold standard to boost the American economy, even though that was devastating to a lot of America's trade partners. The United States repeatedly threatened to withdraw its forces from Asia and Europe when its allies didn't do what it wanted. It also has, some history of backing anti-communist right-wing authoritarians and, helping to destabilize left-leaning democracies. And I think really interesting, the United States, its nuclear war plans actually focused on Soviet weapons that were pointed at the United States while largely ignoring those that would have eviscerated America's allies in Europe. So, in all these different ways, even in the heyday of US liberal internationalism, it often was kind of an America first policy. And then when the Cold War ends, that tendency starts to come more and more to the fore. Because, it's pretty simple. With no Soviet communism to fight, but just this sort of amorphous liberal order to protect, I think a lot of Americans just increasingly did not see the point of global leadership. And so they began electing presidents. Every single election, you could argue that Americans chose the guy that promised to do less abroad and more at home. And so the point of all this is to say that, American support for what we now call the liberal order has been shaky for quite some time. And I really think the bottom started to fall out when the costs of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were then compounded by the Great Recession of 2008. It's really after that you see this new pessimism coming into vogue, the belief that the world is sort of ungovernable and that the liberal order was a bad deal for the average American, and that it's really time to start prioritizing American interests and putting those first. So I think this all creates the backstory for what then emerges with the Trump doctrine, which I don't see really as an aberration. I see it more as a culmination of a lot of these long-running trends, as well as a return to what frankly was kind of a classic US foreign policy tradition. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is that I think in the coming decades, the United States is actually going to become less dependent on the rest of the world. In other words, structural trends will probably increase, at least create a base of support for a more unilateral style of foreign policy. Because I think, the reason Americans have been starting to question the liberal order is just for a simple reason. The United States just doesn't need other countries as much as it did before. The desire to lead the free world during the Cold War was driven in part by dependence. We needed strong allies abroad. Now that the Cold War is over, that dependence has receded, and I think it's going to decline further still for a few reasons. One, and I think one of the most important reasons, is that there's not really a unifying threat that binds America to other nations in the same way that the threat of Soviet communism did. During the Cold War, Soviet communism looked like it was going to overrun Eurasia and turn its resources against the United States. Moscow had twice the military might of continental Western Europe in the early to mid Cold War. And communists at one point were ruling over 35% of the world's industrial resources. And for a while, they were actually winning anywhere between 20 to 40% of the vote in elections in major Western countries like Italy. And so, it's pretty easy to understand why the threats to US security and the American way of life seem very clear. And so the need to nurture a community of vibrant liberal nations also felt like an imperative. But today, it's hard to see really the same kind of galvanizing force. China could potentially pose that kind of rival. It's really the only potential superpower rival. And it certainly tramples on a lot of American interests. It steals American technology, it distorts global markets, it props up authoritarian regimes, it's militarizing sea lanes, it oppresses its people. But China would have difficulty conquering Taiwan, let alone overrunning all of East Asia. It also, even though it certainly helps prop up authoritarian regimes, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't frankly seem that interested in spreading a coherent, cohesive rival ideology around the world. They basically just want to make the world safe for business for them and their cronies, less so about the same kind of challenge that, say, Soviet communism posed. And so I think for that reason, when you look at public opinion polls, even though Americans are increasingly anti-China, they at the same time don't seem that willing to pay that great of costs to contain China. In fact, a lot of people want to reduce defense spending. They don't seem like they want to gear up for sort of a new Cold War, even though there's a whole media meme about a potential new Cold War emerging. So just the fact that there isn't this kind of unifying threat that's going to bind the United States to its allies in a tight way, in the same way that Soviet communism did, means that already there's not much that's going to keep the United States around. I think in the years ahead, US support could decline even more for the liberal order because of demographic and technological trends. So first on the demographics, we're about to enter the most unprecedented aging of the global population that the world has ever seen. Most countries' populations are already growing older, many at extremely fast rates. So by 2070, the median age of the world's population is going to have doubled compared with 100 years earlier. So it's going, the median age in the 1970s was 20 years old. By the 2070s, it's going to be 40 years old. And by that point, the share of people age 65 and older in the global population is going to have nearly quadrupled from 5% to 19%. So, and I think most shocking, for millennia, for basically all of human history, there was a lot more young people in the world than elderly. But in 2018, for the first time, there were actually more people over the age of 64 than under the age of 6. So I think one big result of this huge aging process that's going to sweep the globe is that the United States is going to be really be the only country with a really large growing market of wealthy consumers. If you take the world's top 20 economies, only Australia, Canada, and the United States are going to have growing populations of people aged 20 to 49. Those are people in what they call prime age, workers and prime age consumers. They're the ones, in the prime of their working lives. They're also, a lot of them have kids, and as many of you know, and I certainly know right now with my 2 kids, kids means lots and lots of spending, and that helps drive a huge consumer market. All of the other large economies are going to suffer on average a 16-point decline in that critical age group, with most of the demographic pain concentrated among the world's most powerful economic players. So China, for example, is going to lose 225 million prime age workers and consumers. That's 36% of its current total. Japan, its population of prime age workers and consumers is going to shrink by 42%. Russia's by 23%, Germany's by 17%. Even India, it's going to grow until 2040 and then suddenly fall off a cliff after that. Meanwhile, America's is going to expand by 10% over the course of the next century. So right now, the American market is as large as that of the next 5 countries combined. The United States depends less on foreign trade and investment than almost any other country. But those trends are going to become even more pronounced as other major economies see their populations shrivel. The United States has become even more central to global growth, even less reliant on international commerce. I think the only era where it was ever more dominant economically was in the period right after the World Wars, where it controlled half of global GDP. So it's going to be a major shift in America's favor. And I think that's also going to cause the United States to have less need for staunch allies in for security reasons, because rapid aging is going to hobble the military expansion of its great power adversaries. So, by 2050, Russia's spending on pensions and medical care for its population is going to increase by nearly 50% as a share of its GDP. For China, that spending on elder care is going to nearly triple just over the next 30 years. In the United States, of course, we have our own problem, but our spending is going to increase by 35%, which is a lot better than tripling over the next 30 years. And so Russia and China are going to face severe choices between buying more guns for their militaries or buying canes for their ballooning elderly populations. History suggests they're going to prioritize elder care because you want to prevent domestic unrest. But even if they don't cut their military spending, they're still going to struggle to continue to modernize their militaries at the pace that they're currently at because of the rapid aging of their militaries themselves. So in China, personnel costs, just taking care of all of different troops, already consumes roughly half of China's military spending. That's projected to increase dramatically because there are just going to be a lot fewer young people in order to be around to serve in the military. You're going to have to increase their salaries. You're also going to have huge pensions for the current crop of troops. And so as a result, there's just going to be a lot less to modernize and buy big ships and buy submarines and buy aircraft carriers in the future compared to what they have now. So rapid aging around the world is going to, I think, accelerate, America's economic and military lead over its great power rivals. And it's going to take place alongside the second trend, which is the spread of automation. So machines are obviously becoming exponentially faster, smaller, and cheaper. The latest iPhone has more computing power, and as well as comes with a lot of apps, and is a lot smaller than supercomputers were in the late 1990s. So it's just to give you a sense of the huge increase in computing power. And so today, because of this huge increase in computing power, new machines now basically combine the number crunching capabilities of computers, but also the brute strength of industrial machinery and some of the intuition or situational awareness and dexterity that used to be the preserve just of humans. And so thanks to these innovations, there's been various studies suggesting that half of the jobs that are currently being performed could be automated by the 2030s. Now, of course, new jobs will emerge, but it just shows you the capabilities of machines. And I think, like global aging, this widespread adoption of smart machines is going to reduce America's economic dependence on other countries. The United States already has a substantial lead in a lot of the industries driving the automation trend. I know a lot of people think China is this AI superpower, but the United States has literally 5 times as many AI companies and top tier experts as China. Its share of the world's AI software and hardware markets are several times as large as China's. And so American firms will be able to leverage that technological lead by using advanced automation to replace a lot of these sprawling global supply chains that it's built out over the last 30 years, and instead start to vertically integrate factories in the United States where companies will enjoy, direct access to by far the largest consumer market in the world, cheap energy and other inputs and resources, and access to, a lot of surveys show that U.S. labor is actually most cost effective when you factor in quality as well as the price. I think a lot of service industries too are going to follow suit because AI can take over a lot more tasks. So call centers, for example, are already starting to move from foreign countries to American server banks. There's all other types of automated technologies, things like microseismic imaging, which basically uses powerful sensors and computers to map petroleum-rich geologies. That's already helped the United States frack its way to net energy exporter status. So there's all these different ways that the United States will be able to rely more on itself. For the past 50, 60 years, the United States has had to chase cheap labor and resources abroad and kowtow to various foreign regimes, and many of them quite unsavory. But those days may be numbered because automation will allow the United States to rely increasingly on itself. I think automation could also help in the military sphere as well. It could help the United States contain the military rise of its rivals, because instead of the current American way of war, which basically involves waiting for a crisis to break out and then surging aircraft carriers and armored brigade combat teams overseas, now the United States could potentially pre-position a bunch of armed drones and missile launchers in potential conflict zones. And these would basically act as high-tech minefields that could, annihilate, say, a Chinese invasion force close to Taiwan. And these are really hard to eliminate because you could just have lots of them, and they're much cheaper to purchase. So for the price of one aircraft carrier, the United States could buy 6,500 of these new stealth drone fighters that can be armed with cruise missiles that the United States has already developed, or it could buy 8,500 loitering cruise missiles. So you can imagine a world where if the United States is deploying these kind of weapons en masse, it'll basically be able to capitalize on a fundamental asymmetry in geopolitical objectives. China and Russia want to seize and control territory, whether it's Taiwan or in the Baltics. That's what they need to do to achieve their goal of regional hegemony. The United States just needs to deny them that control, which is a mission that networks of smart drones and missiles are really well suited to perform. So all of this is to say you could see a world where the United States just has less need for foreign resources, for foreign labor, for foreign markets, and Americans will just have less interest in propping up the global economy or protecting allies. So that's the second point. I would say the third point is about the rest of the world and how they are likely to react to these trends. And I actually think nationalism is going to be a major factor even among America's current democratic allies. The same aging and automation trends that are reinforcing US economic and military might are also having the perverse effect of sort of fracturing what we used to call the free world at its core. Because in liberal democracies across the world, support for the liberal order and the Western alliance has long rested in part on stable rising incomes for the working class. Those in turn were largely dependent on growing populations. So you have more and more consumers and more workers always entering the workforce, as well as job creating technology. So, the post-war baby boom produced lots of young workers and consumers, and the assembly line provided them with lots of stable middle-class jobs. But today, populations across the democratic world are aging and shrinking. Machines are eliminating jobs faster than some workers can retrain for new ones. And so this is part of the reason why you see so much about the basic bargain of, like, if you work hard, support the liberal system, and just trust that a rising economic tide is going to lift all boats, why it's starting to break down, and you see nationalism and xenophobia starting to fill the void. So let me just say a little bit more about how I think these trends could play out. I think in terms of aging, the outlook is actually more dire than many people realize in terms of the devastating effect this could have on the liberal democratic world. Over the next 30 years, the working age populations of America's democratic allies is going to shrink by 12% on average, just in absolute terms. That kind of population shrinkage makes sustained economic growth almost impossible. At the same time, the senior populations of these countries are going to grow by 57% on average. And their average spending on things like pensions and healthcare is going to double as a share of their GDPs. And a lot of these rich democracies aren't going to be able to borrow their way out of the problem because they already carry debts equal to 270% of their economies on average before COVID came along and plunged everyone's balance sheets further into the red. And so instead, a lot of these liberal democracies are going to have to start doing things like cutting entitlements for the elderly, or slashing social spending for younger people, or raising taxes, or increasing immigration to rejuvenate the workforce. All of those things are, politically explosive and highly unpopular with core constituencies, and you could see them producing political backlashes. At the same time that this aging is going to impose all these fiscal constraints, you're going to have rapid automation, which is going to create a fair amount of economic turmoil. I'm not a Luddite. I love technology. I love automation. So I'm not trying to argue against it. But I think we have to recognize that, yes, history has shown that technological revolutions create prosperity in the long run. But every single time one of these things has happened, they have forced some workers into lower wage jobs or into unemployment in the short run. And the short run can actually last an entire lifetime. So if you study the Industrial Revolution, one of the biggest technological revolutions, for the first 70 years of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, from 1770 to 1840, average wages actually stagnated and living standards declined. Like the average height of men actually shrunk because they had less nutrition over that 70 years, even as output per worker expanded by nearly 50%. And that's because the gains from mass mechanization during that time were largely captured by business elites. They saw their profit rates double, but most people in those industrializing countries actually saw declining living standards for a couple of generations before things started to get a lot better. So today, across the developed world today, there's been a lot of really rigorous economic studies now coming out showing that machines are once again starting to eliminate jobs faster than displaced workers can retrain for new ones. At the same time, wages for low and middle skill workers are starting to stagnate. And millions of people, especially men without college degrees, are just straight up dropping out of the workforce. And a lot of economists expect these trends to persist for several decades as a bunch of labor replacing technologies that are currently in development, things like, obviously driverless cars, but also robotic stores and warehouses and kitchens, all of these things that employ millions of service sector workers. These things are going to be widely adopted over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so you can imagine the kind of churn that's going to cause in the labor market. So, a lot can change, but there could be a world where you would have sluggish growth, lots of debt, stagnant wages for at least a big part of the population, and extreme inequality. And if you had that kind of economic world, that of course would breed nationalism, and extremism. We've seen this happen again and again. We don't need peer-reviewed studies to tell us that, economic frustrations cause people to generally reject democracy and international cooperation and embrace more radical ideologies like fascism and communism. But there are, in fact, lots of peer-reviewed studies that show exactly that. And today, we have to face the fact that there are ultra-nationalists in the democratic world, and not just like in fledgling democracies in Eastern Europe, like even in a place like Germany, where a right-wing nationalist party like Alternative for Germany can hold large numbers of seats in the parliament, and you see cases of neo-Nazi infiltration in the military and police multiplying alarmingly. So, I think the United States, even if it wanted to lead a liberal alliance in the future, that job is just going to be harder regardless of what the United States wants, because I think nationalism is going to be a major focal point in lots of different countries around the world as they go through this period of demographic and technological disruption. So what would this world look like if the United States did become more rogue? You could see a world where the United States is essentially this economic and military colossus, but doesn't really have a lot of strong moral or strategic commitments. This would be a world where, maybe security guarantees and alliances still exist on paper, but they really start to take on the characteristics of a protection racket, with the United States just asking its allies to pay more and more of the costs to basically pay for that protection. Trade deals that are basically just enforced with unilateral tariffs rather than, through a more systematized institution like, say, the World Trade Organization. And you can see trade deals just basically being about making money, not about the broader goal of trying to stabilize the global economy. Things like democracy promotion and diplomacy would be downgraded, and the U.S. military would change too. It would be a force increasingly geared for punishment rather than the protection of allies. So you would downsize permanent U.S. deployments on allied territory, replace them with roving expeditionary units that can basically steam overseas, smash targets, and then slink back over the horizon. Even worse, there could be a situation where the United States basically just exits the global order business altogether. So instead of trying to reassure weaker nations by supporting international rules and institutions, there could be a world where the United States just starts to deploy every tool in its coercive arsenal: tariffs, financial sanctions, visa restrictions, cyber espionage, drone strikes, to basically wring the best deal possible out of both allies and adversaries alike. So this would be a world with no enduring partnerships based on common values. It would be a much more transactional kind of world where American leaders would be judging other countries not by their willingness to help solve big global problems or whether they're democracies or autocracies, but basically just by their ability to create American jobs or eliminate threats to the US homeland. And you can imagine in such a world, most countries, by that crude calculus, would be totally irrelevant. So there's lots of different, there's been a lot of interesting writing kind of sketching out what this sort of world could look like. I think one possibility would be where American commerce basically starts to shift increasingly back into the Western Hemisphere, and especially in North America, which of course already accounts for a third of US trade and a third of global GDP. And it's the only region that is gonna have all of the ingredients necessary for sustained economic growth. A huge growing market of wealthy consumers, abundant raw materials, a mix of high skill and low cost labor, advanced technology, and relatively peaceful international relations. The Eastern Hemisphere could be a total, battle royale among, declining powers, and won't be interlinked nearly as much. At the same time, you could see American strategic alliances maybe still existing on paper, but a lot of them would just be dead letters. And so the United States might only retain a few sets of partners. One might be with the sort of Five Eyes plus Japan. So, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, because these countries are strategically arrayed around the globe and their militaries and intelligence agencies are already integrated with those in Washington. And most of them, except for Japan, actually have growing working age populations. So they have the potential tax base to contribute to the common defense mission. And the second group might consist of places like in the Baltics or Taiwan or the Gulf Arab monarchies, which share borders or sit very close to America's main great power adversaries, China and Russia. So you can see a world where the United States continues to arm these kind of partners, but no longer plans to really defend them. The United States would essentially be using them as buffers to check Chinese, Iranian, and Russian expansion while trying to limit America's liability for having to do that dirty work. Outside of those two sets of partnerships, I don't know where the rest of America's alliances really go. In such a world, would Americans really still want to defend South Korea against a potential North Korean attack? Would they want to defend a Europe that is unwilling to raise its defense spending meaningfully from any kind of encroachment from Russia? You can see a world where the United States is no longer really willing to just woo countries to participate in these multilateral alliances, and instead asks other countries to essentially petition the United States for protection and market access. And so they have to basically come with something to provide. This obviously is a very scary picture, and some analysts take it a step further and predict outright catastrophe. So a very prominent foreign policy thinker, and actually my first boss out of college, Robert Kagan, has written a bunch of books where he basically foresees a return to the despotism and protectionism and strife of the 1930s, where he basically casts like China and Russia as reprising the roles of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. Another really interesting author is Peter Zion, who basically predicts that the world is going to enter a violent scramble for security and resources, where Russia invades its neighbors and East Asia descends into naval warfare. I think these forecasts are extreme, but they do tap into an essential truth, which is that the post-war order that we all assume is basically normal is actually an aberration. And even though it's flawed and incomplete in a lot of ways, it is largely responsible for fostering the most peaceful and prosperous period in human history. And if it goes away, I think the world would be a much more dangerous place. Countries would have to fight and bargain and shove their way to get things like market access and to guard their supply chains. And they'll have to start defending their borders again. These are all things that they haven't had to do. Many countries have not had to do for 70 plus years, with the United States providing this Western alliance. And so that kind of world would see a return of what we've seen for millennia, great power mercantilism, new forms of imperialism as powerful countries try to reduce their economic insecurities by basically establishing exclusive economic zones where their firms enjoy cheap and secure access to raw materials and large captive consumer markets. China today is already starting to do this with things like its Belt and Road Initiative. You could see those kind of things becoming much more common in a much more hostile and protectionist world. So, I don't think any of this is inevitable. And the piece of good news is that I think in the long run, aging populations and automation could actually make the world at a certain point more peaceful and prosperous than it's ever been, because research shows that older societies tend to be less belligerent than younger ones, and technological revolutions usually boost productivity and, of course, free workers from drudgery. But my worry is just the path from where we are today to that utopia 70 years from now could be very bumpy and tumultuous. And it's going to require, for the United States to continue doing what it's done for the past 70 years, that is uphold security and provide an open trade order in a big part of the world, it would require Americans to take an unusually generous view of their interests. Basically, they'd have to subordinate their own pursuit of wealth and power for a common aspiration for international order. And I think the United States would have to redistribute wealth domestically just to maintain some political support for liberal leadership abroad. But I don't know if that's going to be a path that Americans are going to be willing to follow. I really think a nationalist mood has taken hold in the United States and elsewhere. And for the foreseeable future, it's going to be the shape of things to come. It's not just an anomaly produced by the Trump administration. It's actually a deeply rooted trend that threatens a return to an older approach to American foreign policy, one that prevailed during some of the darkest decades of the past century. I think the best hope is that the Biden administration and future administrations find ways to kind of channel these nationalist impulses in internationalist directions. So the United States has at times undertaken liberal campaigns for sort of selfish reasons. So like it opposed European colonialism in part because the United States wanted to open markets for US goods and didn't want these exclusive European colonies kicking them out. The United States nurtured, of course, and protected a community of capitalist democracies in order to crush Soviet communism. These kind of big campaigns garnered public support because they linked vital US national interests to broader liberal ideals. And I think you'd have to find a way to do something similar today. It's going to be very hard. And, just saying like America is back and going on a goodwill tour abroad is not going to be nearly enough to get it done. So I don't mean to ruin everyone's day. I know there's inspirational things going on with the Mars landing, et cetera. So hopefully we can focus more on those kind of happy things. And I don't mean to say that this is definitely going to happen, but it is a future that could happen based on present trends. And I think people underestimate just how disruptive this aging and automation set of trends can be in the future to US foreign policy, and by de facto by the impact that would have on the rest of the world. So I'll leave it there and open up to questions. Thanks so much for carving out some time in your day to come listen.
Well, Professor, thank you so much. That's just it's a fascinating avenue of scenarios to think about, and certainly something different than we've heard from many folks that we've had on our webinar. So I'm just going to go to the to the questions that have come from the audience, and a couple have referred to the growth of cyber warfare, perhaps negating the aging of a military, and isn't cybersecurity and cyber interaction maybe more important than the military hardware, conventional new military world that you referred to?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously with solar winds, et cetera, we're all very aware of the vulnerabilities that the United States as well as other countries have to cyber attacks. I actually think cyber is going to continue largely in the vein that it's been going, namely that we're in a cyber war right now. It's just this constant kind of every day after day of low level constant cyber attacks on each other, on our companies and then on our militaries. But so far, most countries, most of the time, have eschewed the kind of sweeping strategic cyber attacks, like shutting down an entire electricity grid, for example, to try to cripple an economy. Because I still think a lot of the standards of deterrence apply there, and you don't necessarily have to retaliate in the cyber domain. And so, I think the Chinese, for example, know that if they try to shut down the American electricity grid, that's going to start World War III, right? The Russians too. I think even if you look at the way that they've carried out some of their cyber attacks, like the Solar Winds attack, it's much more about trying to degrade American power, to sow chaos in American institutions, and to steal technological secrets, but to also at the same time try to avoid the kind of huge attack that would then trigger a massive American response, which wouldn't be limited just to the cyber domain. So, maybe we could enter a world where countries just start engaging in full-scale strategic cyber attacks, but most of the sort of rigorous scientific literature on this suggests that a lot of those don't have nearly as much strategic value as you would think, because first of all, they may trigger a big response. But if you also have anonymity, then it's hard to coerce your adversaries with a cyber threat, because in order for them to know that you're threatening them, you have to expose the kind of cyber infiltration that you've done. And if you do that, then your ability to hurt them then goes away. So there's all these kind of things that can potentially negate cyber war as kind of the end all be all. I see it as a very useful tool, both for the reasons I mentioned above, kind of chipping away at each other's national power, but also obviously in a wartime contingency. And here is where I think it's actually the most important issue. Like in a war over Taiwan between the United States and China, one of the first things China would do is use a massive cyber attack, as well as anti-satellite attacks, to try to render the US military deaf, dumb, and blind, so that it can't coordinate all the forces it would need to surge over the horizon to come and fight over Taiwan. And so, I guess what I'm saying is the tactical cyber attack is what really worries most defense planners, and is something I think is a legitimate threat. The large scale strategic attacks, we haven't seen a lot of those. And I think one reason is because the strategic value of them is maybe not as great as it's often portrayed in the media.
Interesting. Just to keep on that theme of the South China Sea, a couple questions on the overwhelming, U.S. military power that it has versus China, and perhaps using Taiwan as a buffer in its second tier of allies. How does the U.S.-China competition in the South China Sea evolve in your mind, over time and given your thesis? How does, if there's a little bit of China aggression, what happens?
Well, I think it'll probably evolve in the way it's been going so far, where China is trying to use weapons below the level of outright warfare, the so-called gray zone, to de facto colonize the South China Sea. So just trying to create facts on the ground, building up features there, flooding the zone with what we call the maritime militia, all these fishing fleets and Coast Guard vessels, to basically bully all the other coastal states there into submission. But at the same time, trying to avoid the big military attack that would then trigger an overwhelming response potentially by the United States. And the reason China wants to avoid that is China's military, its military power falls off pretty quickly the further you get from the Chinese mainland. China, it's often said, has very powerful arms, like it has these powerful missiles, but it still lacks a lot of the power projection capabilities you need to fight on the high seas for extended periods of time. Still, even after China's latest round of naval modernization, about 80% of the Chinese Navy are essentially coastal diesel electric submarines and small coastal patrol craft, not the kind of big aircraft carriers, destroyers, et cetera, you need in order to fight for long periods of time far from home. And the fact that China doesn't have lots of allies and foreign bases it can use to reload and refuel constantly during a combat scenario makes it harder for it to actually enforce its claims in the South China Sea through outright military force. So I don't worry so much about the South China Sea from a military perspective, but I think it's these sort of gray zone tactics that China has been using very effectively to basically create facts on the ground without even having to fight a war. And I think the Chinese are more than happy to continue to do that because it's been paying dividends for them. Where I worry much more, though, is actually over Taiwan, because there it's only 100 miles from China. And so China would have basically its entire mainland and all of its forces available to pour onto Taiwan, whereas the United States only has two big military bases within even 500 miles of Taiwan. They're on Okinawa. And if China takes those bases out, then the United States has to fight from Guam and from carriers coming over from hundreds, even thousands of miles away. So you could see that kind of scenario actually, from a military perspective, being very favorable to China. And that's something I worry about much more than the South China Sea.
Just a concerted force just on that one island. Mm-hmm. One question related to what you just mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative. Is that part of what China is, a tactic in terms of, countering its potential, inability to project power?
Yeah, I think it's especially to counter its vulnerability to interdiction of its oil supplies and other raw materials, most of which pass currently from the Middle East through the Strait of Malacca by Singapore. And, American naval strategists are quite open about the fact they're highly considering blockading China at the Strait of Malacca and through some of the other straits that go down through Southeast Asia to basically choke the Chinese economy out in an extended conflict. In fact, I would guarantee the United States would do that if it was a war of attrition between the United States and China. But even just the ability for the United States to threaten that, of course, gives it some leverage when it in a crisis with China. And so the Chinese are trying to create alternatives to those narrow choke points, some of which are these overland routes and pipelines that they're trying to build from through Central Asia and even extending in some cases all the way to Europe and of course the Middle East. A lot of assessments I've seen suggest those aren't going to be nearly enough to offset China's extreme. It's the number one oil importer in the world, and it's only going to get worse, at least for the next 10 years. And so it's just going to be very hard for China to make that up. Plus, these are fixed targets, so the U.S. military could take out pipelines rather easily. But you can still understand the rationale of why China is doing that. I also think Belt and Road is a lot about trying to export Chinese excess capacity, things like steel and cement that it just has too much of, and to try to create more demand for Chinese exports at a time when its own consumer market is now starting to shrink just in terms of population.
Right, really, it's its own mercantilist strategy. A number of questions are about the world's population and just the imbalances that you mentioned. Can you maybe just jump into that a little bit more? And I was certainly fascinated in reading your article about that working age cohort and how it in the U.S. and how it compares to other countries. but tell us a little bit more about the effects of population itself in around the globe.
Yeah, I mean, it's the United States, is quite exceptional for a large economy in terms of its population figures. It's one of the only, it's the only great power economy that's going to have a growing working age population for the rest of this century. The United States is going to have over 400 million people based on present trends by the end of the century. China's population, by some estimates, is going to be almost cut in half by that time. And if you look at, of course, in Western Europe, you have a lot of similar stuff. In Japan, of course, is already there are more adult diapers sold in Japan already than diapers for babies. And that's only going to get worse in the years ahead. And so, a lot of this, it has to be said, is because of immigration into the United States. And so these things could change. You could see a world where the United States restricts immigration much more and its population figures don't look nearly as favorable. And it's also not to whitewash the impact that aging is going to have on the United States. It's also going to affect the United States. It has a growing elderly population that's going to put the country under enormous fiscal stress. The retirement of the baby boomers is going to be massive. But the United States is unique because every other country has its baby boom population, but then there's nothing behind that. The United States has the millennials coming behind it, which is actually a huge cohort of workers and consumers that can power the economy going forward. Most other countries don't have anything close to that kind of demographic wave coming behind their baby boom post-war generation. So, the United States, there's lots of interesting research about why this is the case. Obviously, one reason is immigration, but others is just you have this big continent, a lot more space, a lot more suburbia. So, people are more willing to have kids than, like in Western Europe, where they typically were packed into smaller apartments for all these years. So I don't know exactly why the United States has such a favorable demographic version, but the statistics, when you look at them, are eye-popping, frankly, where the U.S. really stands out head and shoulders above pretty much all the other major economies.
Do some of those other major economies change their immigration policies?
I think some maybe do, although a lot of the trends that I've highlighted already. I mean, you kind of beta tested this with like the refugee waves that came into Europe and the amount of xenophobia that triggered, and so a lot of those kind of policies tend to trigger backlashes. And in a place like China, they're going the opposite direction. The Chinese regime right now is really promoting this idea of sort of racial purity and what it means to be actual Chinese, as opposed to, say, the Uyghurs or the Tibetans, in order to isolate those minority communities. That, of course, does not lend itself to an open immigration policy that's going to bring in, a whole bunch of people from all over the globe. So a lot of these countries, Japan is kind of tinkering with immigration, but a lot of them just don't have the same history and culture that the United States does as a nation of settlers, that I think has caused the United States to have a much more open immigration policy than any of these other countries are willing to stomach.
Interesting. So certainly one theme that you've mentioned is a lack of a liberal romantic agenda that the U.S. might readapt. There's a couple of questions though that as we finish up here that I'll throw out there as maybe ways in which to rally the troops, so to speak. One would be the impact of climate change, and that's certainly a global issue. And then secondly, COVID and future pandemics. Both of those issues are threaten the globe, so to speak. Are those rallying cries for a more liberal order?
I wish I could say they were, but based on everything I've seen, it almost goes in the opposite direction. It seems like a lot of the climate negotiations have basically been finger pointing exercises, especially between the developed and developing countries, where you have the United States, pointing its finger at China, saying you have the most emissions. And China coming back and saying, well, you have the most emissions on a per capita basis. And by the way, you had, a century or two to pollute. And now that we're trying to industrialize, you're cracking down on us. So you have China and India, so there's this big global debate where countries are basically pointing the finger and trying to assign responsibility. Meanwhile, the climate crisis is just getting worse and worse. And with COVID, I mean, I've been completely dismayed with the international community's response. Yes, I mean, vaccines have come along, but that's largely been national efforts. In terms of international coordination, I mean, vaccine nationalism has been rampant. Countries hoarding supplies for themselves. There's huge parts of the globe that have no access, essentially, to a vaccine. And so the idea that it's going to cause all the countries to come together and try to uphold a liberal alliance, at least based on what I've seen so far, it seems like quite the opposite. I think it's kind of you actually need the latter before you have cooperation on those transnational issues. In other words, you need to create some kind of foundation of cooperation among at least a big chunk of the world's most biggest and wealthiest countries, who can then coordinate action on transnational problems like climate change and pandemics. I think it doesn't go the other way. In a time of crisis, it becomes every nation for itself. And we've seen that both with climate change and with the pandemic. I would love to be proven wrong about these things. But my worry, if you have any Game of Thrones fans out there, I feel like it's just like, all the warring kingdoms fighting amongst each other while the White Walkers are like coming over the horizon. It's very much the same kind of dynamic.
Yeah. So just finally, a question I have, we've all heard about the cycle of waxing and waning of the growth of democratic states. And maybe we're in a period now where democracies around the world are in retreat a little bit. Do you see, where are we now in that cycle, and does this illiberal order stunt that recovery?
I worry that we're in a period of sort of hollowing out of a lot of these democracies, where the basic institutions still exist, but the social fabric you need to sustain democracy over the long run starts to crumble. So like in the United States, we all know that, at this point, the political parties aren't just separated by policy differences, they're separated essentially by culture. And increasingly there's like ethnic divisions that are going on, and especially between urban and rural areas too, these deep, deep divides that are much more of a sort of identity rather than just, if it was just over like, how high are tax rates or something like that, political parties could converge on a solution. But now that they've been infused with identity, it becomes much harder to compromise. It's even seen as immoral. And you see that in countries all across the democratic world, where there's increasing polarization within those countries, and the fringes are starting to become the loudest voices within the major political debates. And I just worry that these tectonic forces that are about to sweep the globe are going to really rattle that up even more and potentially dial it up even more in the short term, just because you're going to have a lot of fiscal stress because of aging, and you're going to have a lot of churn in the labor market because of automation. That, at least historically, has not has produced more radicalism internally. And I think I've come to realize more how much democracy relies on norms and just codes of behavior that maybe can't easily be enforced in a government where you have to share power with an opposition party. And so I just worry that social fabric that you need is not going to be there. I don't think democracies will necessarily collapse, but it's just they become less than they were, not nearly as liberal and open and nice to live in as they were before, much more contentious, and on the brink of sort of internal crisis constantly.
Right. Well, Mike, thank you so much for your perspective. This is really sort of, for me, and I'm sure for our audience, a perspective on realism that really wakes us up to what's going on out there. And we're super fortunate to have your perspective. And I know I'm going to turn it over to Nora in a moment for closing. But on behalf of the council and our audience, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your thoughts. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I don't mean to bum everybody out. This is hopefully more of just a wake-up call so we can all make changes and push for a brighter future. But yeah, thanks everyone so much for coming.
Absolutely. So I'd like to turn it over now to Nora Valenzuela, Chairman of the Board of Trustees, for our closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Richard, for your introduction. And Professor Beckley, it was amazingly informative. Thank you so much. I certainly learned a lot. And I do have to share a view that I have on displaced workers, if I may. It's not only outside of the computer or automation world, even within the automation world, my background is in computer science, so that's my field. Even within the automation world, we do see also exploration or of the older generation who were technologists, but they were subject matter experts on older tools. So as you introduce new tools, as you introduce new technology, if a technologist doesn't continue going to school literally every week, a person who's in their 40s and 50s are already obsoleted because the technology that they used, when I went to school, I was the first girl who graduated from my college in computer science. If I had to go for a job interview today, I will not pass it. I would not be able, and I was a 3-point some grade student. I wouldn't be able to get a job today because the tools that are within the field of automation have changed. So that really is very unique in terms of automation versus the pure science. Because if you're a physicist, if you're a mathematician, you don't expire. Your basic knowledge still applies 100 years from now. It may get added to it, but it still applies. But as a computer scientist, because of the way the computer keep adding to the skill set and the AI, you actually become obsoleted. So the displacement of the workforce even exists within the technology field. So that's really an area where, yeah, it makes it very challenging. You have to continuously go into school. So just want to...
I have a lot of students who are double majoring in political science and computer science. And I tell them, you know, the coding language you're learning now probably is not going to be used in 10 years. So make sure you not only learn stuff, but you learn how to update your skills constantly. And it sounds like
absolutely, absolutely. That's why it's so important for technologists to have soft skills. If I didn't have my soft skills, I wouldn't be able to have a job today. But I'm running a program in the county of Riverside, which is all about my soft skills and not so much about my hard skills of technology. So thank you for sharing your views. It is really amazing. And I hope that our constituents and our members and guests enjoyed and learned today, and I'm sure they did. We truly thank you for your time. And as a tradition, we are offering you an honorary membership to our organization. So you'll be receiving information from our executive director and also operation manager, Jada, and you will be our honorary members. So we hope you join us for future events, whether they're webinars and someday when we have in-person events, hope to meet you in person, sir. With that, I'd like to thank all of our guests and all of our also members and remind you about our upcoming events that the detail will be on our website. Also, we do appreciate the support that you provide to us during these difficult and challenging times. We've been able to provide quality programs because of your support. So we thank you for that. Wishing everyone a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you so much, sir, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.